Medieval knights were known to follow the 5 basic rules of chivalry, piety, honor, valor, courtesy, chastity, and loyalty. That's not 5, but you know what I mean. But they were also forced to perform up to 22 rules and commandments as a medieval knight. And 2 of them was to always be loyal to the church. The 2 codes go, thou shalt believe that all of the church teaches and shall observe all its directions, and thou shalt defend the church. Considering it depended on which ruler was in control of the militia, as there were conflicts between King Henry VIII before and prior. The statements of the Code of Chivalry in regards to the church really depends in consideration of the Spanish militia versus England. Their church systems all still stem from Christianity, but there was a significant difference of the Anglican, Anglo-Saxons, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Orthodox, Protestants, and so on. As of today, there are 12 types of Christianity that branches off to other denominations, so you can imagine, even let's say in the 1200s and early Middle Ages, even prior, Christianity was originally part of the Jewish sector as it was originated with the ministry of Jesus, who in many other religions not directly connected to him still identify him as a Jewish teacher and healer. In spite of the occasional prosecutions dominated by the Roman Empire, the religious movement spread as a grassroots campaign and became established by the 3rd century. And when the Roman Emperor Constantine I converted to Christianity, the rest we know adds to parts of history. As for the medieval knights, who this topic is about, they had to follow whatever the king followed at the end of the day. Otherwise, it would be a risk of their own prosecutions for openly following other religions. And to be fair, this still happens to this day. As of in modern history, in the 60s when Buddhism was more rampant in South Vietnam, their government was more of a Catholic dogma based and was very discriminative to those who didn't convert. So if you had a previous king that identified it as Christians, but suddenly the church turned to a Roman Catholic dogma, you'd have to just go with it, or be persecuted with heresy, as most would be, and faced with public humiliations and eventual execution. Another rule was to be respected of all weaknesses and shall make thyself the defender of them, tying their connection to their duty under God, similar to the Pledge of Allegiance for the United States. When it came to your role as a knight, you were expected as by extension a representative for the church. Your role as a knight was to be looked at as the protector of the church, as well as importantly for the people. A lot of pious leaders in the medieval era would say, especially before the restoration of churches and conflicts of countries and war, would prioritize the concept and idea of God and religion as the forefront, especially with Christianity. Under the teachings of Christ placed in not just the 10 commandments passed alongside with Moses, but the 8 beatitudes noted in Catholicism. So when it came to defending the people, you were expected to do just that. Protect the people. But when it comes to times of war, there was no surprise that some of the knights would be failing to abide these rules and take advantage of villages and homes of the poor and weak, or try to extort them. And considering corruption is pretty big and vast as of all parts of history, it brings us to the understanding that some knights were more likely to follow the guidelines compared to others. Especially if you were just abiding these rules to just gain the benefits and privileges of being a knight, like getting the title, getting a land, and provide an income and opportunities for military and political advancement. Or if any other thing benefited you, which is offering a rich wife that was essential for your connections and major leadership, would also aid in favor as well. Most knights would benefit as well as young ladies, as they would benefit each other, as this was the only way to survive in the Middle Ages. And if you were an immigrant turned into a knight, as that wasn't really likely a very common case, even if you were to fight for a nation that wasn't yours, that never guaranteed citizenship. As the next of rule of code was to love the country in which thou was born, and the irony is, despite loving your country as part of the code, also hinted that you had to do anything and everything your head of state of country you were born from says and do, which doesn't leave room for change or a case of opinion without risk. Like most dictatorships who rise in ranks, if it is an inherited position like being born to privilege, or connections that allowed someone to rise up, if you were a knight and knew your code demanded that not only are you to follow your church, but also to follow the head of state, risk on those who's in control and who actually has the sword. There have been stories of usurpers as well as knights who fight for their king, one famously known as the Knights of the Round Table, a legendary tale of knights who originally didn't want King Arthur but later supported him after they got to know him. The Round Table was to represent equality so that all could see each other and discuss efficiently the changes that they want for the future. Or even the Knights of Templar, who were an elite fighting force for the Iberian Peninsula and were trained specifically to obey the king. But there's still an issue with this code, as it demanded complete blind support and full autonomy over anything the king says, and you need to do, especially if there's a sudden demand in taxes and you can't do anything about it, you still gotta threaten your villagers for the coin. Even as a form of nationalistic ideology, when your home country is under attack and there's a sense of pride and desire to protect and uplift your fellow man from invaders or occupiers, if you're in the military and there's a conflict, people tend to feel their nationalism and their internal duty to serve their country, and if your country had economic issues, you tend to forget about them. Which Which leads to the whole code of thou shalt not recoil in fear before thine enemy. In times of war or any form of conflict, it was a battle or a one-to-one for honor situation. You as a knight were relied on a crucial ideology that you were brave. The phrase of the brave knight meant that in the face of death or the possibility of death, you would handle it the way the idea of a soldier in ancient Rome would. Just face it. Again, tying in with the other codes of honoring God and country, dying for God and country would also mean you were not afraid to do so. So if you were a deserter and ran off, there was also a chance you'd be chased down for desertion. As a result, many would be punished by death if found guilty, and would have a Game of Thrones moment where Ned Stark would execute you the way that you would do honorably. If it was more than one knight deserting and it happened to be a troop or a unit of soldiers fleeing from a battle, they might be subjected to punishment aside death, be tormented, imprisoned, physical punishment, public humiliation, as well as the whole stripping away your titles and statuses. Depending on the laws and customs of the time and the specific circumstances of their actions, desertion as a whole was seen as a very serious offense, as it could undermine the morale and effectiveness of the militia. Which also ties into the wars that the knights would have to get into, as the code that says thou shalt make war against the infidel, as in most of these cases it would mean non-Christians, and without cessation and without mercy. Jeez. In summary, the code gave full permission to knights to engage in combat and basically whack and slice dice anyone they saw who was different, especially those who did not submit to the church or submit to the king. Which ties in the idea that if you ain't around here from these parts, you best get along now before you get what's coming to you. You die. But if you were a knight, you also had the option to not do that, but probably be aligned with desertion for failing to execute those who are like you on sight. Which might also stem from the prejudices that's still connected in today's modern society. It may not be the same lingo, but if you were a pacifist and you didn't care where someone was from, just as long as they were a good person, that's honestly enough. Let people live. But if you were a pacifist knight in the Middle Ages, I wouldn't even know how you even made it that far. After all, there are steps becoming a knight, from a squire to a hand towel boy and a trainee, and it would take a while before a boy becomes a man, and it would very well involve taking someone's life. But hey, again, according to these codes, as long as it's under God's name, maybe you'd be forgiven. But like the other codes, thou shalt perform perfectly thy feudal duties to your earthly lord if they are not contrary to the laws of God, is basically, as I said, about being obedient to the head of state as well as God, as they represent God. Sort of, but they're still a person and no one can be God. This is a good one, as the medieval knights also had to follow, which was thou shalt be generous and give freely to everyone, meaning you had to be nice. So with all the other commandments involved, you still have to be what the church wants you to be, which was nice. You can slay your enemies, but be pious to those who have to be pious to, and thou shalt be always and everywhere the champion of the right and the good against injustice and evil, was another code. That indicated that despite the placement of religion and civil duties, you still had some right and justifications to follow your morals and ethics as a medieval knight. But no matter what the context was, if your lord says you're going to behead the villagers from this area because they're Scottish and we just don't like them, you can still choose to decide if that's reasonable and take a step back, or risk yourself being exiled or facing death for following your beliefs. There are so many mindless soldiers in this type of history that although you want to do your duty and protect your home, you have to ask, who am I really protecting? My home, my people, or myself? Or am I actually protecting them, or am I just doing what you told me to so I can keep my house? Crazy how things haven't really changed though. Aside the 10 Commandments, the Code of Chivalry, as we know, of the 12 chief rules of courtly love. Yes, if you were a knight, you had to follow the cha-cha slide steps and make sure that you were to find a dame, you have to follow the rules. Like, thou shalt keep thyself chaste, pure, for the sake of her whom thou lovest. As chastity was important for both men and women. As it was all under one God, the rule of keeping yourself pure for your future wife, a pious knight would also be able to do so, but for someone who cannot control themselves may not be able to be the best for this rule. Even when you involve yourself romantically in exchanges of letters, as that was a form of DMing somebody, you'd also have to involve yourself with the families and the blood lineages. Thou shalt not knowingly strive to break up a correct love affair that someone else is engaged in, which a lot of people in modern dating scenes also seem to not do. With someone who's already with someone else, even back in the day, there was a desire of the chase, and sometimes a medieval knight who might go to war the next day might want a spicy romantic candlelight dinner before he dies or something. But you know what else is wild about these codes, especially the courtly lovely ones, was that they still have codes like be mindful completely to avoid falsehood, but right under the list is thou shalt not have many who know of thy love affair. They literally right behind the other says be honest and nice, but don't lie to your partner, but also potentially don't tell them how many side things you got. That is actually hilarious and very wild, as this basically is bro code for the knights. Thou shalt not speak no evil, which is also part of the 12-part code, as it meant that you can't backbite or backtalk someone, as it does ruin reputations as well. When it came to reputations in general, we've slowly became the type of generation where we do want to defend and honor our existence, but we've also learned to let go of the idea if someone has a perspective of you and tries to talk about it, it doesn't change who you are or the concept of who you are. It just means that people who believe it never intended to get to know you and were just waiting for someone to talk badly about you. But in the Middle Ages, Gossip was a huge thing, even for knights. Although they teased and mocked women who gossiped, the knights also had nothing better to do and wanted to see what the tea was. If you're a woman and you wanted to date a knight and you found out Sir Jeremy wanted Susan of house whatever the heck, and you knew she was pregnant before her rich dad helped her give the baby away, you had the choice of telling the knight, or, you could just tell him that hey, she had a kid already, or you could just spread the rumor and have Jeremy find out. Either way, the same goes on both ends, as knights, like all humans in general, talk a lot of mad things and have no problem being critical. But of course, that doesn't come with a price. And speaking of that hypothetical situation of Susan of whatever the house heck and Sir Jeremy, another code is thou shalt not be a revealer of the love affairs of others. I guess in some senses, even as a knight, you aren't supposed to be exposing your homies or yourself on who you are interested in. Royal ladies were usually married pretty young, and if you were aligned to marry someone of your choice based on your level of success, it was best to not tell anybody. Which explains the earlier rule of being secretive. Even though it involved the basic rules of chastity, the knight's loyalty was due to the spiritual master, God, to the earthly master, the king or overlord, and to the mistress of the heart, his sworn love. Love, in the chivalry sense, was a largely platonic and non-physical. As a rule, only a virgin or another man's wife could be the chosen object of chivalrous love, as most knights were aimed to have a wife that was a reflection of Mary, the mother of Christ, whose the cult of Virgin Mary was the relegation of a noblewoman to a pedestal reached its highest expectations. And finally, one fun rule that they have as a knight: in practicing of gifts of love, thou shalt not exceed the desire of thy lover, meaning you can buy your girlfriend a present but just don't spoil her, because you're a pious man and your duty is to ensure she stays in check all times and that she's grateful that you got her anything at all. As another in this rule was just as important in giving and receiving love gifts, let modesty be present. In medieval times, the wives of knights were known as ladies or dames, and these titles were used to denote their status, as where they were often accompanied by their other honorifics, such as lady of the manor or dame of the court. And even if you were providing a gesture, you still had to make sure God was in the room. Otherwise, you'd be left with another rule: thou shalt not choose for thy love anyone whom a natural sense of shame forbids thee to marry. But again, although knights were allowed to get married, if they joined groups like the Knights of Templar, they have to be celibate and mimic the same dedication to the church like the monks. I don't think it would be the same as prevalent now. If you had to join the army, you'd be told to be celibate, but would you still join? Either way, when it comes to this part of history, they definitely did. Speaking of history, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. Be sure to like and subscribe. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye!